part of the reflections this morning. Bidle is my name, and I want to say one of the reflections I have is it's just planned beautifully. Whoever designed to do this, I just heard a train whistle going by. The one thing I remember preaching at this place was having to get quiet at times so you could be heard because the trains were going roaring by, either in the old church or in this church. And Joe and I are just extremely glad to get here and be with you today. It's just a pleasure to be here. Actually, everybody tells you that when they come back and say that. It's a pleasure to be here. But last night when Janet and Louie and Joe and I went out to eat, and we got caught in that ice mess that occurred all over the highway, and Louie was driving. It is a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to reflect a little bit right off the bat. Molly met us as we came in the door and was showing us all around the church again in remembrance. And I was struck again by the window. And last night, Joe and I, when we arrived in town, drove by to look at the window from the outside. And that window was a spirit of this church. So I particularly remember the lower figure that's standing looking up was part of the choice. And for years I had a copy of that whole window that Amy Dingenheimer gave me as we were going to leave. I understand she lived to be 102 or something like that. Anyhow, she gave me a copy of that, and somewhere in all my moves hither and yon, I lost that. But that picture in the bottom is a quote from the 27th Psalm, where it says, "Thy face, O Lord, do I seek." Because when I arrived here, Earl had been here for 27 years, and I came with that spirit of the seminary, just graduating, and I, at that point in time, knew everything. And I came here, and you were the most tolerant congregation, and wonderful people, because you put up with all those learnings that I had to do to discover. I didn't know everything at that time. As a matter of fact, when later we were doing training programs for ministers across the country, we would not take them until they'd been in the church for 5 years. So they got through the belief that, after seminary, so they got through the belief that they knew everything and had settled down to be learners again and seekers. And seeking was the key part of that phrase in the 27th Psalm. So it was put in the corner so that the church at that time, it was the 1950s, people were pouring into this church, and we were saying, oh, it's a great time to just open the door to all kind of, like a university of seeking and searching. And so that was put in that corner, looking up through the cross, to the Bible, and then this corner at the top, the fishes, of course, reflect being on the lake. But above that, in the corner where you have those funny dots and the circles, that had a special meaning at that time because we were doing so much in small group work and little study programs all through the church that we had. And that was what that symbolized, the group sitting there in Christian fellowship and Christian discovery. So that's a part of that whole window mystique that was created. I came here in 1954, and I came to be minister to youth on the weekends because I was in Oberlin, and Reverend English Earl had been here 27 years, and so it would look like we could use someone who could be. That's a reflection I have of this church too, by the way, because it was down in the old church not long after I got here. I raised a glass of water to drink, and there were 2 olives sitting in it. So I came to be interviewed. Now I was only going to be here on weekends, so it wasn't full time or anything like that. And the group who interviewed me were 6 men, only men, no women interviewing a minister who's going to deal with the youth. I thought that was amazing, but I came in, I had put together in my head all the theological things I should be aware of and thinking about. And Lee Creel, who's here today, was one of those I remember who was interviewing me, and we sat down, he Scotch before I came here, and so I had a ring with a Masonic emblem on it. And I was sitting at the table being interviewed, and P.B. Morgan, if you know anything about P.B., was a 33rd degree Mason and lived Masonic Lodge. And he looked over and saw my ring, and he said, I see you've met our friend Hiram Bidle. And I said, oh yes. And I told him where I had been raised to a Master Mason and that. And he looked at the rest of the men and he said, well, I don't think we have any more questions for him, do we? Let's go eat. And it was true in those days when I first got here, you needed to be one of two things. You needed to be both things. You needed to be a Mason and you needed to be in this church. At that time, it was a remarkable period. And in the 50s, it was wonderful to be in a church like this because we needed to grow. It wasn't that our ministry was so good, it was the doors were open and people in those days, in the 50s, flocked into the church. So all you had to do was have a church and open the door and people came in to take part in things. So being here and being a part of that first year after I had been a youth minister and then after I became the associate for Earl for that first year, it was again Lynn Creel who took me down one day and said, I want to show you something. This was a Sunday morning before church just ready to start. And he went into the kitchen in the old church and he went in and it was Tom Williams' Sunday school class. It was all boys and it was 3rd and 4th graders, if I remember correctly, and Tom Williams was teaching them. And there was no place for anybody to sit. There was absolutely on everything. The boys were sitting on all the counters in the kitchen and everything. And I turned around and I said, well, I knew we had a group coming in like that. He said, we need a new church. And the church idea began to develop from that and emerged into this experience that we have here and now and the dedication of it. So it was one of those great experiences. You were the most tolerant kind of congregation. I took stories from this church and used them all through the rest of my ministry. Funny stories, a lot of them. One of them, if anybody remember Bob and Lois Ferguson. If you're old enough, you remember Bob because he ran a popcorn wagon downtown. But Bob and Lois had a house down in that section of town in which the bathroom was just off the kitchen, a little half bath, with no windows in it. And they had a son named Les, and Les was about 2 years old, and Bobby was telling me the story of that one morning. He got up and he was thinking about getting off to work, and they were in that period, called the Battle of the Pot, where you are very involved in helping your child discover how to do things to make life easier for him and the rest of the family. So he got up that morning and he had eaten breakfast with Les, and he picked him up and took him and he walked over and put him on that specially designed little chair in there, and then absent-mindedly thinking about work, he reached over and flipped out the light and shut the door. And there was this moment of silence and this small voice said, "Where did I go?" Now, that's an actual story from Bob and Lois when they were here, and I've used that story across the country many, many times because the workshops we were doing were always helping people ask the question, where do we go? What do we do next? And where do we go from here? So that's the question for a dedication day, isn't it? Where next for this church? I've been so fascinated by seeing on the internet, I hope all of you do that, get it and read the history of the church, because what Betty wrote, and that is just awesome. That's, I think, the best thing I've read anywhere about churches. And what she wrote about this church is just remarkable. And when I read all of those things that have happened when Louis came here, by the way, that was one of the gems of reflection, is the break that we had because we needed an associate now. Earl had helped for a while, now he was going to stop. And we needed an associate, and I said, let's go to Oberlin, see if we can find someone there. And then I checked out and found that Louis and Janet were back from Germany, but would he be interested in coming here as as an associate, because from seminary, when I was with him, I thought he was the brightest guy in all of seminary, and I thought, boy, if we could get him for what we're doing, that would be terrific. Excuse me. And it happened. Everything worked together. As you might say, God had it all in mind. And so we got Louis and Janet to come here and be an associate, and then take over the whole church. And all of those things that have happened in the life of this church are absolutely phenomenal when you read about that. And I know you received an award of some kind here, didn't you, for the church who did more for the community or something like this, a very special award a few years ago. And that, for me, was reflection of the grandness of this church and the congregation. We had all kinds of things that we were able to get started here, and that I was able to take from here when we left and go other places with it. Well, Christy said, make sure you keep it short. And I think I've already told more than I should and talked more, but reflections they make you lose your terminal facility sometimes. At any rate, I'll just close with a story about the man in a church like this, who the men's club had a wonderful men's club. And they came together once a month for a big meeting, and they always had this same program, which was one of the men would get up and say whatever the topic they wanted to talk about. And then they'd have their dinner, and that was it. And this has been going on for several years. And it was this man's turn to get up and talk to the men's group. And he stood up and he did the very same thing he had done the year before and the year before that. He happened to be a graduate of Yale. And so he talked about the Y of Yale standing for youthfulness in Yale, and the A standing for the adoration